Afternoon, good evening, Rarest Photos, whenever you're watching this. I'm excited to bring you this interview between me and Nancy Pease. Now, who was Nancy Pease? She was the nurse that took care of Gary Pepper. Now, if you don't know who Gary Pepper is, then you got a treat coming, because Gary was a young gentleman that did newspaper clippings back in the early days to make money. Now, it wasn't a normal young man. He had a condition. Nancy's going to talk about that. Cerebral palsy is what it was. And he used to do newspaper clippings of different artists, and he would make his money that way. And so Gladys actually heard about this young man somehow and told Elvis about him. And anyhow, so they started paying Gary for newspaper clippings. Now, he ended up being the president, really president of the Tankers fan club. And when Elvis came back from Germany, that iconic photo, which I'm going to show right here, is Gary meeting Elvis and greeting him. Gary apologized that there wasn't more fans there. But anyhow, this is a great interview. I hope you stick around for the whole of it. I do want to have another conversation with Nancy as well. And I really want all the information that's in this interview to come to light about how Elvis and his generous spirit and his kind soul changed somebody's life. So, and of course, how Elvis's death affected Gary. So, without further ado, here's me and Nancy Pease. And special thanks to Jenny Jorgensen, who set this up. Jenny is Nancy's sister. And I have a bunch of negatives that I'm still trying to get developed for Nancy and for Jenny. They sent me some of Elvis's hair as a gift as well. Very, very kind of them and very cool. Anyhow, here we go. Nancy Pease, Joe Sins, Rarest Photos. All right, everybody, this is Rarest Photos. I've got a treat for you today. I've been talking off and on with Nancy Pease, who was Gary Pepper's nurse. Gary Pepper, of course, was the gentleman that had muscular dystrophy, or cerebral palsy, I'm sorry. I always get those two confused, but had cerebral palsy that Elvis befriended before he went into the Army and took care of till his dying day. Until Elvis passed away, Gary Pepper was taken care of. And Nancy Pease Whitehead is a huge part of this story. And I'm going to let her tell her story and ask her some questions and just have some conversations about Elvis, about Gary, about Priscilla Presley, about Colonel Parker, about Vernon. She was there all those years, and she was with Gary all those years. She was at the funeral. She was at Graceland when Elvis passed away, with the family. And it's a wonderful story that I think has more than one part. I think we're gonna have another storytelling time at some point in time with her and I. I'm gonna reach out to some other people that Gary respected, that respected Gary as well, including potentially Ann-Margret, who was very loving towards Gary as well. So some background here. Gary Pepper was the president of Elvis's fan club. He had cerebral palsy, and the rest of it, really, I really want Nancy to tell the story. Elvis gifted him a '57 Chevy, very cool car, and he made sure that Gary did not feel as though he did not have a purpose and a place in Elvis Presley's life, even though he had cerebral palsy. All right. Well, I did want to share something real quick, since we're just starting a video here. Before you introduce yourself, let's go ahead and let's see if this comes up on the screen or not. Hey.
Oh yeah, that's when I first moved there. Gary wanted me to not wear a uniform.
Okay. All right.
So yeah, he wanted me out of the uniform, so I started just wearing regular clothes.
Now, which house was this on what street?
This was on Eva Street. It was way across town in that little bitty house where I lived with him for until Mom came down.
All right, well, good deal. All right, so I can see the middle half of your head. Maybe back up a teeny bit from the computer. If you just back it, maybe oh, I see those great Elvis pictures in the background. That looks great. Now everybody can maybe bring the computer down just a teeny bit. Perfect. All right. As you can see, I got some Elvis stuff in the background. I think I showed you that last night when we were having a little chit chat.
Right.
But yeah, so let's just get started. So Nancy Pease is Pease your maiden name
Yes.
or middle name? Okay, all right, all right.
Well, I use
So
it for
you use it for what?
I use it for a middle name.
Okay, all right. I've got three middle names. It's Joseph, James, Michael, Kane, and Sin. So
Mine's
I don't have
Nancy,
to. I can just
James,
take whatever.
and Pease, Whitehead.
Okay, so you got four. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, my father was Catholic, very heavily Catholic. So he named me after four Catholic priests, and he figured that it would even out our last name of Sins, S-I-N-S, like the Bible. So, all right, let me get this adjusted a little bit. Can you see yourself in the screen before you get started? Why don't you maybe introduce yourself and tell everybody your introduction to Elvis? Maybe not when you met him, but maybe how you grew up loving Elvis and what drew you to him in general.
Yeah. I was in sixth grade when I first heard of Elvis. And from then on, I had just followed him. And
So sixth grade. What year was that?
oh
For
God,
I know I'm trying to figure out when I was in sixth grade.
yeah, I was
I'm
born
just
in
thinking like
45.
45. So that was about 58, 57,
Yeah.
58, right? Yeah, probably
Well,
57,
yeah,
yeah.
when Elvis first came out, I know my dad used to make us all go to bed at 8 o'clock, and that's when Elvis was on Ed Sullivan, and we used to try to sneak down while the TV was on. But I remember in sixth grade, Thanksgiving vacation when "Love Me Tender" first came out.
That's an
That's when
amazing
I
song.
went to, yeah, I saw "Love Me Tender" over and over and over again.
So
But I know that's when I was in sixth grade.
you see it?
What?
Was that on the Ed Sullivan show that you saw it? Was it on the Ed Sullivan show that you saw that?
Well, actually, I my dad wouldn't let us stay up past 8 o'clock, but we kind of would try to sneak downstairs. But the first time I guess I really saw Elvis was "Love Me Tender."
Yeah. Oh, the movie. The movie you were talking about,
Yeah,
right?
and of course, movie magazines and everything.
Yeah.
I used to read them all.
Now, where did you live growing up? Was it in Memphis? Was it another state?
Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I grew up in Iowa.
Mhm. All right, good deal. And of course, Elvis went into the army. I'm sure just like every other American girl and woman out there, you were lamenting the fact that he could have been killed at war. The loss of his music, the loss of his movies. Do you remember anything about that time period of like wondering when he's going to come back or like how you felt about it?
Well, I was never worried about war then, but he was over in Germany for like 2 years. But it was pretty tragic because he just lost his mom, and he was over there. He was real homesick, and he met Priscilla, and I think a very vulnerable time in his life, and I think she sort of took advantage of that.
Yeah, and that's what a lot of the followers of Rare of his photos really believe as well. Just out of curiosity, when you said that he lost his mother, and you were aware of that, of course, it was in the news, but was the media talking about how he was kind of lost or sad or like what was the general consensus of America? Did they think it was just a normal loss, or did they know it was such an amazing loss to somebody that loved their mother so much. It was a little bit not normal, I guess. It wasn't a normal loss because it was almost his whole life for a while.
Right. He was extremely close to his mom. And when he lost her and then uh, had to go to Germany, it was just devastating to him. And he was
And
homesick.
like you
And
said,
that's where Gary was real important to Elvis because he and his mom, um, he was the president of the Tankers fan club
mhm.
while Elvis was in Germany. And Elvis wrote him a letter thanking him for keeping his name alive while he was overseas because Elvis was afraid he'd lose his fans,
Mhm.
and the 2 years they'd forget him. But Gary and his mom used to uh, keep all of his fans up to date, and they used to have like contests on movie magazines, and Gary used to uh, get all his fans together and vote for him. And Elvis credited him and his mom for helping to keep his name alive while he was in Germany, his music alive.
And that's very important. You know, Elvis was. It seemed to me that Elvis was he was very rewarding with loyalty for those that were loyal to him and that loved him and truly cared about him. So it's no surprise to me to hear that story. You know how Elvis wrote a personal letter to Gary. And then when he came back, of course, there's the photo that everybody has seen pretty much, which I'll show on this video, um, of Gary greeting Elvis. I believe it was at the train station or bus station when Elvis got back from
Yeah,
Germany.
it was at the train station. His mom pushed him in the wheelchair, and Gary greeted him. And I remember Gary apologizing to Elvis that there weren't more fans there because it was a school day. But
Right.
yeah, Elvis just included Gary in everything, and they were real close.
So let's fast forward a little bit. What year did you? Well, actually, you met Elvis before you met Gary, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So what year was that? Maybe tell the listeners and the viewers the story of meeting Elvis for the first time, and then we'll talk about how you ended up meeting Gary and taking care of Gary from that point.
Yeah, I think I was about 21, and my sister Jenny, she's 3 years younger than me. We went on our
Hi, Jenny.
went on our first trip out of Iowa. We had a little Fairlane Ford, and we went down to Memphis, and we were staying at a little apartment, and we were running out of money. And we stopped by the gate to say bye to Harold because we were going to go home. And he says, "No, don't go home." He says, "Elvis is on his way home, way here." And he said, "Go around the corner to Charles." He gave me the address on Charles Avenue. And he said, "Knock on the door. Albert Conrail will take you in." So we did that. And yeah, Albert, and it was Albert and his wife Cecil and her mother Granny. And Shirley Cottonelle, their daughter was married at the time, so she wasn't living there. But yeah, Albert took Jenny and I in. Jenny stayed until I think it
Now,
was Elvis.
when you say Albert took you and Jenny in, are you talking about to their home, to the Memphian theater, to um,
Yeah, when Elvis was home, let's see, this was after Jenny had left. I was there with Albert and Cecil. And Cecil used to call up to the mansion every night that Elvis was home, find out what he was going to do that night. And um, the guys used to call and or answer and said, well, he was going to go to Memphian that night. So Albert drove Cecil and I and dropped us off, and Cecil knocked on the window of the theater, and the curtain parted, and I think it was one of the guys let us in because they recognized Cecil because she was
mhm.
um, a fan that they recognized. And I know that I was sitting with Cecil behind Elvis, and she said he keeps turning around and looking at us because he knows you're new. So anyway, Cecil, she used to chew snuff, and she got up. She wanted to go to the bathroom. So I said, okay. So we went to the bathroom, and when we came out, she says, wait here, because the guys were in the lobby, and she said, Elvis is in the bathroom. So we waited until Elvis came out, and um, she took me over and introduced me to Elvis, and he shook my hand. Nice to meet you. She says, it's Nancy from Iowa. And
Highway.
yeah. So then we went back in and watched the rest of the movie. That was when he was married to Priscilla. And there was the whole row of them. It was Elvis, Priscilla, his dad. I think it was Dee at the time. You know,
So
when,
this must have been 63-ish, 64-ish. I mean, do you remember the year? 62-ish?
well, I graduated in 63. I think maybe 65, 66. I'm kind of guessing.
All right.
But
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean,
anyway,
it's hard for me to remember last year, let alone if you're trying to go back 20, 30, 40, 50 years to figure out what day it was. But
yeah.
now for the
But
fans out there
anyway,
that might not know who Albert is, who Cecil is, and who Harold is, do you want to explain who those three are that were there, that helped you meet Elvis for the first time?
yeah, their daughter Shirley, when she was 14 years old, she was a huge Elvis fan, and they used to live somewhere in Memphis. And she, um, that's when they were starting to build up Whitehaven. There was like
Mm-hmm.
uh, they were building homes around Graceland, and she had her eye set on this home on Charles Street, right behind Graceland. And she was an only child, very spoiled, and she talked her parents into buying that house, her house. And so she moved in
Oh,
behind Elvis, and um, she Elvis met her, and she was like 14 years old, and she used to go to the fairgrounds with him.
mhm.
And I know she said one of his concerts, she used to go to all his concerts, that he sang the song Little Sister for
Okay,
her. I mean, she said that's why he sang it.
right.
But she wrote that book, The Man in My Backyard.
Now,
And
Charles Street, we have
that
Elvis
was in
Presley Boulevard.
Charles.
Yes.
Charles, yeah. There was behind Grayson, there was Dolan, the first
Mm-hmm.
corner after you turn Dolan, and then then there was Charles.
Which you got Graceland on Elvis Presley Boulevard, then you go down Dolan, and then you take a left on Charles, I think, right? And that's right behind Graceland.
Correct.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I was
That
I was I was just there. That's why I kind of remembered the Charles going down that
yeah.
street, saying, "I wonder if we can see through the back of anybody's yard into the back of Graceland." So
Oh
you,
yeah, because you could just peek over the fence
yeah.
to see the back of Graceland.
So they helped you out, and of course you got to meet Elvis. He was polite and kind, as we all know. Elvis is a you're there. You go. And then so after that, how were you introduced to Gary?
Well, um, Albert talked me into staying, and I I got a job at Methodist South. It
Okay.
was just a couple blocks from Grayson, and I was working nights, and I used to go down to the gate about maybe 8 o'clock and just hang out in my uniform, and then I'd go from there, walk over to Methodist South and work the night shift. And Carl Nichols was a big friend of Elvis. He, in fact, was in charge of redecorating Graceland when Elvis
Mm-hmm.
first bought it. And he used to jokingly say that Elvis's taste was early whorehouse because he had it decorated in red. And
Right.
yeah, and his wife was a huge friend of Gladys. And they were just real good family friends, Carl Nichols. And then when uh, let's see, starting back when Elvis first met Gary. Um, Gary used to have a clipping service, and he would, uh, he and his mom would get like 5 or 6 copies of the newspaper, and they'd send clippings to people like wedding, birth announcements, and then they'd have a form letter and they'd ask for a donation. And Gary started clipping articles about Elvis, sending them up to Graceland and for Gladys's scrapbook. And the first Christmas, I think it was the first Christmas they had at Graceland, because Gary had met Elvis when he had that house on Audubon. Gary and his mom used to sit.
That's how far it went back. It was probably, but that would have been 1956, maybe early 57.
Yeah. It was when Gary first heard of Elvis on that show Red, White, and Blue. I think it was Nichols. No, not Nichols. Phillips.
Dewey Phillips.
Yeah. Dewey Phillips. Yeah, and Elvis, started really. He was really a fan of music, and then when he heard Elvis sing "That's All Right, Mama," he got to be a huge fan, and his mom used to take him, and they'd hang out by the Audubon house. And then when they moved up to Graceland, I think it was the first Christmas Elvis spent at Graceland, his mom said, "Let's invite that young disabled man guy who sends me pictures." So they asked him and his mom to come to Christmas. And while they were there, Elvis asked Gary, his mom used to speak for him because his speech was real affected, asked him how his Christmas is going. And she said, "Well, not too good. My husband just got laid off from the laundry." And so Elvis turned to his dad and he says right away, he says, "Daddy, give Mr. Pepper a job." His name was Sterling Pepper. So he didn't really have a job for him, but they put him on the payroll. And his job became a guard at the gate. But he had his uncle, Vester. He was working the day shift from 7 to 7.
Vester.
And then his cousin, Harold Lloyd, was working the night shift from 7 to 7. And what Mr. Nichols' job was, or Mr. Sterling Pepper's job was, just to show up every day. And if one of them would call in sick, he'd fill in for them. Well, they soon got word of that. They both started calling in sick. So Mr. Pepper was working all the time. So Elvis changed it to where Vester would work 7 to 3, and then Harold would work 3 to 11, and then Mr. Pepper would work the night shift 11 to 7. And he did that for several years, and then he had a heart attack in the guard shack. And when Vester came in at 7 o'clock, he found him dead. He had died of a heart attack. Gary's dad. And up until then, Mrs. Pepper was a real strong woman. Her whole life was Gary, just, taking care of Gary. And Mr. Pepper took care of everything else. I mean, she'd never written a check in her life. She didn't have any worries except Gary. And when Mr. Pepper suddenly died, she just flipped out. She was helpless. And Gary said that she wanted to die and she wanted to take Gary with her.
Yeah,
and anyway, what happened was Gary and his mom were living in this little house on Eva Street. And Elvis realized that he hadn't seen Gary at the gate for a week or so, and he was getting a little bit worried about him. So, and Gary told me that he hadn't had anything to eat. His mom wouldn't get out of bed, and he was sitting on the floor, and he was saying that he was sure that they were both going to die. And he said that he was listening to the radio, and Elvis was singing Bridge Over Troubled Water. And then the doorbell rang, and it was Elvis, and he was there with Priscilla and I think a couple of the guys. And Elvis was appalled at the condition that Gary and his mom were in. It was just a terrible condition. And so right away, Elvis felt very responsible for them. And he hired Mr. Nichols. Mr. Nichols' job was to take care of their finances and he'd hire little, it was the whole neighborhood had turned into a black neighborhood, and he'd hire these little maids to come in and cook for them and take care of them, and then they'd be alone at night. But they'd have somebody there during the day, and Mr. Nichols would take care of their finances and stuff.
So this had to be around 1970, 71, maybe, because if Priscilla was there, came over, they were, they'd been still married at
They
the
were
time,
still
or was it
together.
even earlier? Okay, all right.
Yeah. So anyway, that's how Carl Nichols got his job.
Mm-hmm.
And then I knew Carl from the gate, and he knew I was a nurse. And it was fun. He used to tell stories about Elvis. And he told me once, he said that he was sick. He had cancer. And he said he can't keep up doing what he's doing for Gary. And he asked me if I would consider taking his job. And I said, sure. So, yeah, so I went to work that night, and Carl picked me up at the hospital. And I'd worked all night, and I went to, okay, I got to back up a little bit, because in the meantime, what happened with Gary and his mom was she was very hard to live with, to work for. She was manic depressant. She was mean. She was a very difficult woman. She was very strong physically, but she didn't have much of a mind. And Gary had a really good mind, but he was pretty helpless physically.
Now,
And
any brothers? Did they have any brothers and sisters? So is it Gary the only child?
he was an only child. She had, I think, 5 sisters that were all in California. And Mr. Pepper, he had some family that were in Whitehaven, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But they were the only ones that lived in Memphis, was Gary and his mom.
How far was Eva? This is Eva Court, right?
Eva Street was way over in mid-Memphis. It was way over across town.
Okay.
And what happened was Gary, they had a couple of poodles that weren't really house trained. And Gary used to walk on his knees. And he got an infection in his knees. And so they took him to the hospital, and they put Mrs. Pepper in a nursing home. And while Gary was in the hospital, no, after his knees cleared up, they put Gary in the nursing home with his mom. And what happened was one of the orderlies tried to steal the ring that Elvis didn't give it to him, but it was one that Anita Wood, Elvis had given to her. And then when they broke up, she gave that to Gary. And
so Anita gave the ring to Gary, and then one of the orderlies were trying to steal it?
Yeah, one of the orderlies would try to steal it. And Gary, he couldn't really express himself, but he would start yelling really loud, And this orderly used to feed him. And he fed him too close and too fast. And Gary aspirated, and he got aspiration pneumonia. So he went back to the hospital. And then he was really sick. And when he finally recovered enough, they wanted to send him back to the nursing home, and Gary refused to go. He would not go back to the nursing home. He wanted to go home. And Carl Nichols was really in a bind because to send Gary home, he was really weak, with his mom. But they took him home. And that's when Miss Carl Nichols took me over there, right? Gary had just come home back to from the hospital. And I had worked all night and picked me up at 7 o'clock and dropped me off. And he says, just do the best you can. He says, you got to feed him and feed them. And when I went there, Gary's bed was wet and he was so weak he couldn't really turn over in bed. And I couldn't find anything. I couldn't find any linen, no towels. But Gary told me that the maids used to, when they'd leave, they'd steal stuff. And the only thing I could find in the refrigerator was some like moldy bacon and sour milk. I couldn't find anything. I couldn't find, I remember cleaning Gary up with a pitcher. And I had a pitcher for the water, and I found a washcloth or something. I can't really remember, but it was such a hopeless situation that I did the best I could. I didn't have any food to feed him. Mr. Nichols came back and picked me up about noon, and I was sitting there, and I was just devastated. And I said, just take me back to Albert's. I said, I can't do this. It's too much. And I heard this little voice from the bedroom saying, Nanny, don't leave me.
Yeah, very overwhelming, I'm sure.
Yeah, that was Gary saying, Nanny, don't leave me. So,
hey, real quick, I'm going to pause this real quick just to make sure I can save it from where we're at, and then we'll pick it up from there.
This meeting is being recorded.
All right, so I wanted to make sure I saved it from there. You know how the internet can be. I mean, sometimes it gets unstable, and I was getting some unstable notifications. So you heard a voice from the other room saying, "Don't leave me," and that was Gary.
This little weak voice saying, Nanny, don't leave me. So I told Mr. Nichols, I mean, I was so tired. I said, well, I guess I will. So I remember calling the hospital, and I didn't give them any notice. I just said, I'm not coming in anymore. And they said, well, you're on the no rehire list. And I said, that's okay. I said, I think Gary's going to die. And then if that happens, I'm just going to go home to Iowa. But I said, I can't leave him. So anyway, Mr. Nichols took me shopping that afternoon, and we bought, oh my God, all these linens, cleaning utensils, food, just everything. And I remember when I came back to Gary's, I cleaned him up. I fixed some food, and I slept on the couch that night. And from then on, I stayed there. And it was amazing to me how fast Gary improved. I mean, he started, because he had some hope,
Right?
And he started really improving so fast that it wasn't too long. He wanted out of that bed, and then he wanted out of the house. And he had this Chevy convertible that Elvis had bought for him, and now he had somebody that could drive it, and he wanted out of the house. And we just, I started driving him to Graceland, and we just started up his clipping service again. And he just got to be where he was normal for him.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I know with his father passing away. Now, was his mother still in a nursing home when you were taking care of him? Did she ever?
No, his mom came back with him.
Okay.
And I know that when I went in that morning, it was in the winter time, and she had it was a floor heater. It was up to like in the 90s. It was really hot in there, and she was she would just stare straight ahead, and she used to be incontinent. Um,
Yeah,
she was,
no struggle. So segueing, so we were going doing the backstory. How long after that, where you moved in and started taking care of Gary, did Elvis come by before that or after that? It would have had to have been before, right? That he found Gary on the floor.
well, that was before.
Mhm.
That was way before I met him, because that's when he put Mr. Nichols in charge, and they had the maids come in during the day.
Okay.
And it was only after Gary got sick and went to the hospital, recovered, and then insisted on coming home, that that Carl Nichols
Gotcha.
took
And
me into.
of course, Elvis. I mean, I've always read that Elvis had Gary on the payroll up until Elvis's death. So there was money that was coming in, um, some money. I don't know how much money, but maybe enough for Gary to live. Um,
Yeah, Gary, Elvis didn't want him to think it was charity, and he wanted Gary to feel like he's earned it. And he gave him the title of fan club correspondent and fan club coordinator and foreign correspondent.
right.
And he'd pay Gary $100 a week.
Okay. Yeah.
And
Which
yeah,
I mean, I don't know how, like, 1977, $100 is probably close to $700 or $800 a week in nowadays money. Maybe
it it
more.
was it was pretty good. But we had she had Social Security and Gary had Social Security. And then with the $100 a week, it was livable,
Right. Yeah. I'm
And yeah, we used to Gary. He loved that car that Elvis gave him, but he wanted a new car, and he told me the story about Carl Nichols said, Gary, we both need new cars. And he said, I'm going to ask Elvis to give us new cars. And Gary says, well, good luck. Elvis doesn't like to be asked for anything. He
That's
doesn't.
funny. That's funny that Gary knew that. Not
Yeah.
not that Gary was really asking Elvis for anything, but he must have heard the stories of how
Yeah.
generous Elvis was.
Gary
Elvis,
knew that Elvis is real generous, but he didn't like to be asked for something. So
right.
I guess Mr. Nichols went to Elvis and asked him if he'd give him and Gary a new car. And Elvis said, talk to daddy.
Right.
uh, if you talk to daddy, Vernon is real tight.
Yeah, he'd
There's
say
no
no.
way they're going to get a car. So anyway, Gary had this Chevy convertible, and Elvis had bought it for him because it had power seats,
Hmm.
and so Gary could, um,
Get in and
have
out
power
easy.
windows.
Hmm.
Yeah, and then his mom used to drive him around in it. But Gary got in his mind he wanted a new car, and so we traded it in for Monte Carlo, a brand new Monte Carlo.
Hmm.
And the car was in the trade-in parking lot. And we used to drive by there every day, and it was still there. And Gary used to cry. He wanted the car back. He
Sure.
wanted both cars. I said, Gary, no, we can't afford it. So anyway, he was so upset, and he didn't know what was going to happen to that car. And I remember we're down at the gate, and there's this couple from out of town, Elvis fans, and I mentioned to them about the car, and they were so excited. They went and they bought it from the used car dealer. So it went to good hands. It went to some
Yeah.
fans, and they were so happy. They bought Gary and I a bunch of stuff. They bought me some clothes and Gary some clothes, and they were just real happy. So
That's
his
nice.
car got a happy ending. He had his Monte Carlo, and then Gary insisted he wanted to learn how to drive. And I thought, oh my God. So anyway, he fashioned this. I don't know. They used to have like a suicide stick. I
Hmm.
don't know, on the
I think
steering
that's the
wheel.
term. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, and he had this thing welded on where it was like a bar, and he could use his hand to turn the steering wheel. And he wanted to learn how to drive. I said, Okay.
Yeah.
I let her.
You're
And
brave. You're brave, but you're brave and very kind. You know, a
yeah,
lot of people would say, no, no, you can't do that, Gary.
yeah. So anyway, actually, Gary got his driver's license. I went. They had this computerized thing where you stand, and I was holding him up, and I helped him learn.
No.
He got his driver's license. I
So he
know.
must have been able to drive because he would have had the test, I think, right?
Yeah,
Or was it
yeah,
just a written test back in the day?
yeah. It was pretty scary, but as long as I was in the car with him, I could help him see. But I know one time we went shopping, and this was after my mom had lived there, had moved here, and we were living in on Dolan Street,
Hmm.
and we went to the shopping center, and mom and I went into some store, and Gary said that he would wait for us. And I says, well, don't drive around. But he did. He drove around. And without me helping him, he banged into another car.
Oh, I'm sure.
And it was, did some damage, but we got it fixed. But anyway, we actually went to Iowa with Gary and his mom and to
So
visit my family.
you moved there. You had to move to Iowa, is what you're saying with Gary?
This was just a visit.
Oh,
We were
visit.
still
Okay.
living in Memphis, yeah. And Gary was driving, and like, the cop pulled us over because he was going like too fast. Like,
Oh God.
I remember the cop. The cop couldn't believe it. He could not believe Gary was driving. But anyway, yeah, we made it back to Memphis, and um,
Now there's a lot of people that don't know what Gary's condition was. Was it muscular dystrophy? Was it, you
I
know,
was cerebral palsy.
cerebral palsy? Okay,
Yeah.
and Elvis was big in the 50s. On donating to cerebral palsy and as well as yeah. So
The March of Dimes
Notre
and
Dame's is
polio,
was huge.
you
Yeah.
know.
So
But
yeah. So
but
so you went to Iowa. That would have been what year? 72, 73, 74. Like, I mean, I know we're kind of the dates are probably a little bit blurry,
oh
but
yeah, I'm not going on dates, but
okay.
we just visited my family, and then we came back, and at this time that Gary and his mom and my mom and my little brother and me were all living in on Dolan,
Okay.
and people used to think that Elvis bought the house for Gary. He did not, and um, Gary used to own that little house on Eva Street, which is
Okay.
really all they needed.
Right.
But then when my mom came, we needed something bigger, and then the house on Dolan came available, and mom and I bought that.
So in those years, I mean, you would drive up to Graceland with Gary. Um, did you ever get a chance to see Gary and Elvis interacting? Did Elvis come over to the house? Did Gary get to go up in the Graceland during those years when you were taking care of him, or was Elvis gone too much on tour?
Well, Elvis never came over to our house, but we lived next to Vernon.
Hmm.
And at that time, he was divorced from Dee, and he was living with Sandy. She was a nurse
Yeah.
that he'd met when he was in the hospital. And she had a little girl that was about the same age as Lisa Marie, and they used to play together. And
Right.
I used to babysit for him. When Vernon and Sandy would go somewhere, I'd go over there and stay with the little girl. And I got to be real friends, pretty good friends with Sandy. She was also a nurse, and we had a plum tree in our backyard, and I used to give her plums, and then she'd make plum jam and give me some jam. So
Right.
yeah, I got pretty close. And Vernon, one, I used to teach guitar when I was young, and
Okay.
I could never really play.
I
I
didn't know
don't.
that, but you can still teach it. You must be able to play decently to be able to teach it.
Oh, I couldn't play really, but I could teach it.
Okay.
I was not, I mean, I could play it, but I wasn't a guitarist, but I was a pretty good teacher. So Vernon wanted me to teach him guitar. And when the way I was teaching, it was like teaching music, and he gave up right away. He didn't want any part of that. But anyway, yeah, I got to know Vernon and uh, Vernon and Sandy pretty well. And then I met Nash, his aunt Nash.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, she had this little church in Mississippi that Elvis had donated
Hmm.
to her, and she was um, a let's see, a Baptist, certified Baptist minister or something. Like I don't know, they call them the Holy Roller or something. And I
Yeah.
grew up a Catholic, but then I sort of got to where I lost my Catholic faith, and my mom was a real big Catholic, and we used to go to church with Aunt Nash every Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
Mom didn't like that. She wanted to just go to church one time a
Right.
week and be done with it. But yeah, Aunt Nash got to be real good friends. She used to go to have services at a nursing home on Mondays, and I used to go with her to that. And I got pretty close to Aunt Nash. And I remember the day Elvis died. I know this, he died on a Tuesday, and it was the Sunday before when we went to church. She was like laying by the altar and just crying. And she said she's so worried about her nephew. And then the next Tuesday, oh, I guess it's Tuesday that I was supposed to go to the nursing home with her. And she called me and she said she's sick, she can't go. She said about 11 o'clock, she got this real weak feeling. She just had to lay down in bed, and she thinks that's when Elvis died, was
Huh.
at 11 o'clock that morning.
You
And
know, people that love each other have a connection.
yeah,
Like
uh,
my wife and I've been married 18 years, and when I've got something wrong with my left side of my back, her back hurts. When she has a headache, I've got a headache. So you can be so close connected to somebody that you could pick up on those things. So that may be the time that Elvis passed away was the 11 o'clock that Nash
yeah.
felt.
She said
That Sunday,
she
that
said,
Sunday,
well,
sorry.
Elvis's mother had died on a Sunday,
Yes.
and Elvis died on a Tuesday. And that Sunday is when she was so worried about Elvis.
Hmm.
And then it was Tuesday at 11 o'clock. She said all of a sudden she felt all the strength drain out of her body. She said she couldn't get out of bed. She said that's when she knew Elvis died. So, but anyway,
Wow. So um, did Gary go to Elvis's funeral?
yeah, we, we lived right around the corner. And when Elvis died, you would come out of our house and you would be overwhelmed with all the smell of flowers because, Grayson was carpeted. All the flower shops were sold out. And I remember we used to go to pick up Gary's check, and we go around the back entrance. And well, when Elvis was alive, we'd go up the front entrance.
Hmm.
But then after Elvis died, we'd go at the back entrance and pick up his check, and they kept it in the kitchen cabinet. And I remember the first time, it was a Friday that we went around to pick up the check. I couldn't believe the crowds. I mean, it just got to be like a circus, and they were
So, so
pulling
that
leaves off of the trees and stuff and climbing the walls. And I thought, what, Elvis isn't here, or what are you
yeah.
doing? It's real
So,
depressing
so
to
was
me
was that
because,
Friday when you said the first Friday? Was that right after he passed away? He passed away on a Tuesday. I think he was buried on Thursday. And then are you talking about
yeah,
that Friday? Okay.
yeah. What happened was Vernon had the open casket in the foyer, and all the fans would come and pay homage, and the line stretched around by our house. Just throngs of people. And Gary and I was pushing Gary. Mom stayed with Mrs. Pepper because she was usually out of it. And I was pushing Gary in his wheelchair, and we were in the line. And I guess Vernon, somebody told him that Gary was in the line, and so he sent somebody to come in and bring us up to the mansion. I remember we spent that day, and I remember Lisa Marie, she's 9 years old. She was standing behind the casket, and she was stroking his hair. And we stayed there all day, with the family. And then when we went to the funeral, just Gary and I, and we were in the family room. And I remember there were like Ann-Margret, and there were let's see.
Maybe. I mean, was Mindy there? Maybe Mindy Miller might have been there, or Linda Thompson. Was Mindy Miller or Linda Thompson in that room as well?
The what now?
Was Mindy Miller or Linda Thompson in the room? Those were, Linda Thompson.
Oh yeah, Priscilla came right away,
Mm-hmm.
and Linda Thompson and Ginger were all there.
Okay.
And but I know that Gary and I were in the family room, but people like Ann-Margret were not in the family room. So
well, I mean, y'all are family. I mean, Elvis knew Gary from '56. He knew Gary
yeah,
long, and of course, you being, Gary's caretaker and, and taking care of. I know Elvis valued that, and
yeah,
Vernon valued that as well, I'm sure.
yeah.
Um,
So
so
anyway, yeah, we went to the funeral. Afterwards, we were in one of the white limousines that followed the hearse to Forest Hill Cemetery.
right.
And we drove to Forest Hill Cemetery, and it was unbelievable. You've seen the crowds,
and the
but
and the flowers.
driving down Elvis Presley Boulevard, there were just there were girls just passed out from the heat. It was in August.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then you'd see like a whole bunch of white people and then a whole bunch of black people all along the route to Forest Hill Cemetery. And then they put him in that mausoleum. And then somebody tried to steal his body, and that's when they moved him up to
Into
Graceland.
Graceland, yeah.
But
So I'm going to pause one more time and stop the recording.
This meeting is being recorded.
All right. Yeah. So, and of course, that was August of 1977. And we know, I think it's either you and I talked about it or me and Jenny talked about it, or maybe I read it. But there was a time when Vernon stopped paying Gary.
yeah,
Was
yeah.
that 77? Was that 78? And I know that changed things. So maybe tell us the story there.
Yeah, it was like Elvis died in August.
Mm-hmm.
And we got a letter from Vernon's lawyer, I think it was in January, saying that he was no longer an essential employee and that they wouldn't pay anymore. During that time, Harold was a smith, and Vernon pretty much cut the Smiths out of everything. Harold, they gave him a job at the car museum or something.
Mm-hmm.
Billy Smith, that lived in the trailer behind Elvis, it was still in Elvis's name, but it was basically Billy's home.
Right.
They kicked him out, and Billy went to work for the railroad. And Harold used to tell me that Elvis would roll over in his grave if he knew the way Vernon was treating the Smiths. But anyway, yeah, there were, after Elvis died, like it was like a circus. I mean, it all became like
Well,
souvenir shops and everything. And um, there was a freelance photographer, I think from Canada, that came and to our house, wanted to do make a documentary about Gary and Elvis, and it was just, at that time we had the Graceland fan club too,
mhm.
and they were doing a lot of I don't know.
So obviously, so you guys, so Gary was cut out as an essential employee, but you were still running the Graceland, or he was still running the Graceland fan club at that time, or did that have to stop once?
Well, uh, Eddie Poole was the Graceland president. Gary was sort of like just a figurehead.
Mhm.
But we had people come. We had this one woman come from Louisiana, and she told me the story of her husband was in the army when Elvis was, and she said that when Elvis was in the army, her husband took their little boy, and he had like a soldier suit on, and he met Elvis, and he became a huge fan. And then I think he went to Vietnam, and he got real depressed, and he was suicidal or something. And Elvis, Betty was her name. She had written Elvis that if he remembered this little boy
Mhm.
when he was in the army, and she didn't really expect to hear from Elvis, but she did. And Elvis had sent her son, who was a grown man, but he was suicidal, really depressed, sent him a packet of pictures and stuff, and said that it literally saved her son's life.
No.
So she came to the Grayson fan club celebration or something we had, and we picked her up at the airport, and she stayed with us on the house in Dolan, and she became a real good friend. And she actually moved there from Louisiana, and she got a job as a telephone operator, and she lived with Albert for a while after we left.
So,
But
this Albert fellow, I still don't exactly. So, how did you meet Albert? Because Albert was very instrumental in you taking care of Gary, and
yeah,
also you meeting Elvis, I believe, because of the daughter, Shirley, right?
well, I knew Albert before I knew Shirley,
Okay.
because Shirley was married, and I met Albert. Yeah, I was really good friends. He loved my mom. um, I know that I was working at Methodist South when Mammy died. Mammy was in the hospital, and she was my patient. And she died while I was working at Methodist South. And I remember we went to her funeral, and Shirley was there. I met Shirley there. And then Cecil had a lot of uh, cognitive problems. I know one time it was like in the middle of August, she wanted to go down the gate with me, and she got her fur coat on. I said, no, Cecil, because Albert would keep it really air conditioned. I said, you don't need that outside. So,
Right.
but yeah, Cecil died eventually, and Albert met my mom, and he really loved her. And Albert lived several years after that. And I remember we'd go to Memphis and go up to Grayson, and do the tour and everything. And
Hmm.
we'd stop at visit Albert, and he lived for several years, and then he finally died. But yeah, he's a real good friend. He warned me. He says, Nancy, do not take that job with Gary. He warned me. He says, no, Nancy, you're getting into trouble. And of course, I didn't listen to him.
Yeah, you quit your
I
job. You
mean,
quit your job at the hospital and jumped right in. It was the opposite effect.
yeah,
Which is amazing. And of course, there's a sad ending to this. I mean, with Gary not getting the $100 a week, which was, and nowadays is about $850 a week in today's money. You know,
right,
so without getting that pretty much really he suffered because of that, and it wasn't Elvis's fault. And I don't know whether it was Vernon's fault because the attorney was saying if you don't cut non-essential employees, who knows? I mean, but
Well, Vernon panicked when Elvis died. He
yeah,
thought that he was going to be poor again,
right, yeah,
and I know, kudos to Priscilla that I mean, Vernon wanted to sell everything and just get some money, and Priscilla knew that she knew his fans,
hmm
and
yeah,
so
and I heard there was a lot of the city of Memphis wanted to open it up as a museum, but Vernon probably would have sold it to the city of Memphis to do that possibly.
yeah, he
Uh,
would have sold everything.
yeah. So
Yeah,
because it was the same fear that Elvis had. Elvis had a fear that he was going to become impoverished like he was as a child, which is why he continued to take all the fluff movies that were
yeah,
not very good because they were guaranteed money. And if he didn't have guaranteed money, all the money that went out every month to the family, to the Smiths, to the, Jerry Schilling, to keep running, to do all the stuff he did would go away. I mean, he couldn't have a single break without making sure he was making thousands of dollars somehow or tens of thousands. So I guess I can understand Vernon's fear that everything was going to go away because Elvis wasn't bringing money in anymore, and everything was still going out.
yeah,
So they made him cut, which is sad that they cut. They couldn't find something that was essential for Gary, but Vernon didn't have a very good business mind to think, okay, well, Gary could be running this part. He could be a figurehead to keep Elvis's, fans connected to Elvis,
mhm,
because it was such an important story that could have been told in a bigger picture, after Elvis passed, and it just didn't, unfortunately.
yeah. But yeah, Vernon was a strange person. I mean, you know, Gladys carried him all her life. He had a bad back and wasn't working, but Alice was, of course. And then when he met Dee in Germany, Elvis really disapproved of that. So soon after his mother died, and he married
Hmm.
that Dee. But yeah, but they at the time, I after Elvis died, Memphis was always such a happy place for me. After Elvis died, it was so depressing. I didn't want to stay there anymore. I wanted out, and of course, we were making payments on that house, and we and I wasn't working. My mom had Social Security. Gary and his mom had Social Security, but I just told Gary, I said, I'm going home to Iowa. And I said, and of course, Memphis is the only home Gary had ever known, and he wanted to stay there. And I said, well, I can't force you to do whatever you want to do. But I said, you you were in a nursing home that you found horrible. And I said, you'd probably end up in the county home, which should be worse. And I said, I can't force you to do anything, but I said, you're welcome and your mom to come to Iowa with us. So they went to Iowa with us
Good.
and they stayed there. That was in April. They stayed there till it was November, and Gary was terrified of pneumonia.
Right. I'm
And
sure.
we had moved them to, Mrs. Pepper called it the frozen north. And they were so afraid of an Iowa winter.
Hmm.
And then they had the Tates, her family, they were all out in California. And so they decided they were going to go out to California and live with the Tates. And I told Gary, I said, um, you're going to end up in a nursing home. But he trusted Johnny Tate, his cousin, and he ended up in a nursing home. And it was like 2 years after when Gary left me, he was in really, really good shape. The only medicine he was on were vitamins. Um, I used to take him swimming, used to lift weights. He was in pretty good shape
Yeah.
when he left me. And sure enough, they weren't out in California very long before they were both in a nursing home. And 2 years after Gary left me, the Tates didn't tell me, but Albert did. Albert read his obituary in the Memphis paper, and he
So
told me that Gary had died 2 years, and ironically, he died of pneumonia
yeah.
in
I
a
mean,
nursing home.
Well,
And then,
that's normally how you die of the aspiration. I mean, and so this and it was at 78. Was it the year after Elvis passed? You guys moved to Iowa. Was it that close after?
yeah, we moved, let's see, we moved in April. Elvis died in August. We stayed till April. And then we moved to Iowa in April. And then Gary and his mom stayed with me in Iowa until like November.
And then they went to California, and then
And they went to California.
yeah, and then of course within a couple of years, I think you said, was it a couple of years that he passed away, or was it later?
He lived for 2 years after he moved to California.
That's
And
just such a sad ending. And of course, like you said, Elvis would be so upset with not just how the Smiths were treated,
yeah,
Billy and Joe, who were the closest closest family to him. I mean, he played racquetball that morning with Billy and Joe that morning that he passed away. They lived there on the property, but he would be so terribly upset of what happened to Gary because, he made sure that Gary had care, and that he had money coming in and he had a purpose. And that was such a wise thing for Elvis to do, to give him a title like
yeah,
that. So he didn't feel
yeah,
like it was
yeah.
charity because it wasn't really bringing Elvis any money in. It really wasn't. If you think,
No, but
you know,
Gary, after he recovered, we started his clipping service again. And then he used to write an article for a British publication called Elvis Monthly.
okay,
And Gary used to write articles for them. And then when I moved in with him, we started writing for Elvis Monthly called Memories. And
okay.
we used to write, and they'd send us some money, for the articles we'd write. But yeah,
So,
Gary
so,
was
so Gary couldn't talk very good. Could he type? Could he write? Or did you do that?
no,
Did you do that for him?
he um he could write very laboriously. He would put a paper on the floor and he'd hold it with his knees and he'd write. What was affected with Gary was his speech.
Mhm.
He it was real hard to understand him because the cerebral palsy affected his speech. He was very spastic,
Right.
and his hands. He couldn't feed himself. The more he'd try to hold a spoon, the more he'd shake, and it'd spill all over. So he couldn't feed himself. He couldn't really talk legibly. You get to where you could understand him if you were around him enough.
Mhm.
He could walk on his knees, and other than that, he was in a wheelchair, but he could walk if I walked with him and if I held him up. And it was kind of amazing. Like at Elvis's funeral, when we went to Forest Hill Cemetery, um, Ann-Margret knew Gary because he had sent her some pictures or something and some clippings, and he used to send. He had a big album. He'd send stuff to presidents and celebrities, and they'd send him autographed pictures instead of money.
Sure.
That's what he asked for. So she knew him because he used to send her uh, clippings and stuff. And so I remember we were at Forest Hill Cemetery, and she was there with Roger Smith.
Mhm.
And I remember we were walking, and I was kind of holding up Gary, and we were walking, and she was talking to us. But yeah, she was really good for Elvis. I mean, she didn't marry Roger Smith until after Elvis married Priscilla,
Yeah.
and El, Elvis he did the maid said that he cried the night before the wedding because he said he had no choice, and because she was like 16 when he moved her into Graceland,
Yeah,
and
which I think that part of it. She was actually almost 18. She was a month away from 18, and the media has put it out that she's 16. She's even said 16. But in
uh,
1963, when she moved to Graceland in May, She was only 1 month away from being 18. So, but
Oh,
regardless, I mean, that's what I've always felt. That's what I've always heard, that he was kind of forced into it because he did. That was the girl in Germany that they asked him about. Any
yeah,
special? No, nobody special, he said. But
yeah,
he spent a lot of time with her, and of course, there's a lot of misinformation that has been out there. So it's good for me to hear, and for everybody on the Rare of Us Photos channel to hear that he was sad, that he was forced into it. I mean, it's not good to hear that, but everybody believes that he wasn't doing it of his free will because it happened so quickly, like that,
yeah.
and he certainly appeared to be happy, but then again, Elvis Presley was a performer.
He's a good actor.
He was a good actor. He really was. And I think that he probably did try. He
Yeah,
and part of crying, he probably, he was forced into it, but he also was probably a bit fearful he'd lose his career.
yeah.
You know,
Well, Colonel Parker, the whole thing was arranged with her parents and Colonel Parker.
yeah,
And I remember Elvis saying that he had no part of it. He said that the place where they're married was a little bitty place. And he said he had nothing to do with it. If the, I think most of his friends were not at the wedding. It
no,
was her parents, her
Esposito was there,
her sister,
but yeah,
um,
Red,
Colonel
Red,
Parker, I think Joe
yeah,
Esposito.
hmm,
And then, but if Elvis had gotten married the way he wanted, it would have been in Grayson, like they had the reenactment.
right,
But to go to Las Vegas like that, it was so arranged. And I know that Ann-Margret, they were really had an affair going, and he really loved her, and he did the rest of his life, and she did him. But she understood that he had a prior commitment to Priscilla. I mean, he
right.
couldn't get out of it because, her dad, Elvis would have been arrested for taking a underage girl across state lines.
Right. I'm going to pause it real quick. I'm going to stop it real quick and start again just to make sure we get it saved.
This meeting is being recorded.
Yeah. So even, I mean, even nowadays, I mean, you don't have to prove anything happened. You just have to prove the intent and the act. So even back then, the fact that, it wasn't even across state lines. It was another country to another
Yeah,
country, and then across state lines going out to California, then Las Vegas. And the
yeah,
parents knew that when she flew in the first time to to go to California, uh, they didn't know that she went to Las Vegas, and she was so there was certainly something that they could have used, to
yeah.
force it. Um, it's just the common sense test that, and I don't want to say the Priscilla fans don't have the common sense of it. They just want to believe the fairy tale that she put out in the book.
Yeah.
And in reality, I mean, there are things that are nefarious that happen in this world, and that was one of them. And I think, you know, I think that his life changed drastically getting married.
Well, his life changed drastically when he went to the army. I really believe, I really believe that Elvis would have gone into special services, but Colonel Parker wanted to make him the all-American patriotic guy. But if he would have gone into special services, but Colonel Parker would have been giving away his music, and he wouldn't have that. So Elvis went. Uh, That's when he got started on sleeping pills and uppers when he was in the army. That's where he met Priscilla, which was a disaster. And but I remember Billy Smith. They were talking about Priscilla and Elvis's relationship with women. He said Elvis's um, life expectancy for a woman was maximum 4 years. And Elvis knew that. He knew he should not have gotten married.
Right.
And he said, I'm not saying he wasn't fond of her, and he wanted her to come over because he was like infatuated at first.
Mm-hmm.
But he after 4 years, I mean, it happened with Linda. He started going with Ginger while he was still with Linda. But that's what Billy Smith said, that women in his life lasted maybe 2 to 4 years max. And Elvis knew he'd get bored with different women.
Well,
So
and here's the thing too. I mean, Elvis passed away at 42, which is incredibly young.
yeah,
That's 7 years younger than me right now.
yeah,
I mean, I'm 49. So, I
yeah,
mean, I got married at 30. I was ready to get married. I mean, I was a country music singer and I had a lot of relationships. And, there's a point in time when you're ready to settle down. Elvis
yeah,
wasn't ready to settle down in 1968 when he was 33 years old. He just
yeah,
wasn't. Like, I wasn't on top of the world. My wife and I did more together in country music than I did myself. Um,
yeah,
but the 4 year, 5 year period, a lot of people said it was because of the common law marriage laws that were in Tennessee back. So you had Anita Wood, that
yeah,
was prior to five
yeah,
years. And then of course, but I believe Elvis wanted to think that she was who she said she was, the person that she portrayed herself to be in Germany. But I think that, the whole Child Bride book that was written by Suzanne Finstead, where Curry Grant had supposedly, allegedly coached her how to be, how to act, what to say. That's the image that Elvis fell in love with,
hmm,
was infatuated with. And then Priscilla, what she was in love with was this rock and roll rebel that Elvis was not. Elvis was a sweet, kind, considerate,
yeah,
loving, spiritual person, that also felt that he belonged to the world, that God was put him here for a purpose. That's what
yeah,
his mom always told him, the loss of Jesse, and you've got something special. So it's unfortunate that who she fell in love with and who he fell in love with, they were completely not real. So
yeah,
it was never going to work.
no. And then, she, of course, he was having affairs all over the place, and so did she.
Yeah.
And that really destroyed Elvis, because his idea of a wife was like his mother.
Mhm.
She'd stay home with the kids. And I know that Lisa Marie, when they got a divorce, that's what hurt Elvis,
Sure.
was having Lisa Marie away from him for so much of the time.
Yeah, I mean
He,
it's tragic. And what I've read, what I've heard is that while Priscilla and Elvis were married, Elvis was not fooling around during that period. He didn't fool around with anybody until after she had her affairs, and then he
yeah,
did. Then he did,
yeah,
because I think he was one of those people that committed. He committed to acting. He committed to singing. He committed to be in the
yeah,
army. And so I think once he was forced to be married, if that's what happened, then he was going to be committed to try to be a good husband as much as he could be,
yeah,
and not cross that line. And then, of course, she crossed the line, right after Lisa, about six
yeah,
weeks or 8 weeks, 12 weeks. I don't know how long after. Um, but it's sad because you could see the difference in Elvis after the divorce.
yeah,
During that time period, that's when things started just going downhill, and it stayed downhill. It never really went back up. He just was a constant decline all the way to 77. When you look at photos, when you see what he did, because his world was back and forth. His daughter was gone. His marriage was over. That he really was going to try to do, even though he didn't want to do it. He was going to try to do it. And then on top of it, the financial drain of paying for everybody in the world and having to tour all the time. And then
yeah,
that takes a toll on your body. Get your uppers, downers, going to sleep, different cities, you know.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I know he's a cash cow for people. He was supporting everybody, and he just kept performing until he died. You know,
Yeah.
but he just felt like he had to support everybody. And
Which
the
is,
darn Colonel
yes.
Parker.
So let's talk about Parker a little bit. Now I know Parker he was in Madison, Tennessee. It wasn't like he was at Graceland. So
Yeah.
you probably didn't ever run into Colonel Parker at all. Did you ever hear any stories around there about Parker that were positive or negative? I mean, there was things that he did that was positive in a way for Elvis, and then there was a lot that he did that was negative.
Well, I know when I was at Forest Hill Cemetery, I heard Vernon say this, or Colonel Parker say this. He was standing in the lawn in his Hawaiian shirt, smoking his guitar, and he says, "Elvis isn't dead. He's just easier to handle."
Ugh.
That's what he said. And, you know, he wanted to keep his money rolling in. You know, he took 50% of everything Elvis owned.
Right.
But he knew how to push Elvis's buttons, and he knew how to control him. And he preyed on Elvis's insecurities. And when Elvis wanted to stop, he didn't want to do those movies. And Colonel Parker said, if you break your contract, you'll never work again. And you scare him that way. But you know, Elvis was really a good actor. I mean, from his first movie, Love Me Tender, he had this natural ability.
Yeah.
And King Creole was incredible. And then he started getting worse and worse movies. He was just Colonel Parker just pushing movie after movie, low
Low budget. Yeah.
yeah. They said the movie that really put the nail in Elvis's movie coffin was Blue Hawaii, because
Which is interesting because it's one of his biggest albums. It's one of his biggest soundtracks that sold. It's one of the most endearing movies that people remember of Elvis, at least after the King Creole period. You know, you know, GI Blues was a fun little movie, even though it wasn't high quality. It was after the Army, so people were excited about it. But yeah, I mean, I would have thought that Blue Hawaii would have been something that would have not put the nail in his coffin. But he had Paradise Hawaiian style, then Blue Hawaii, and you know, it was fun in Acapulco. So there was a bunch of these same things. But yeah, Elvis deserved better roles, you know, and you know, Colonel Parker, and I don't want to say rightly so, he did put the fear in Elvis because Elvis was spending so much money because, like you said, he was paying for everybody. So the truth of the matter is, I mean, Colonel Parker knew what was coming in. He knew what he was taking. And Parker only took 50% of Elvis's earnings from 1973 or 74 on. It was 25% before that.
Mm-hmm.
But still a lot of money. You know, most managers are 10% or 15. You know, but regardless of that, Parker was spending all of his money broke too. And
well, he was gambling it all the way, you know.
Gambling it all the way.
Yeah. But I know that Elvis felt so responsible for supporting everybody. And I know that I heard when Lisa was born, Colonel Parker said, now we've got another mouth to feed. And he just preyed on this, on Elvis, that he had to keep working. He had to keep supporting these people.
Yeah.
And he just worked him to death.
And that's what I've always thought. You know, Elvis dying at 42, he lived two people's lives, if not three. And the amount of work that he did, the amount of stress that he had, you know, and so he was 84, he was 126, one of those two ages when he died. He didn't die a young age. He died in a younger body, you know, that had an old soul that had the weight of the world on him.
Yeah.
I mean, I know how stress affects me, you know, and so I can't even imagine the monumental amount of stress that Elvis had to provide for everybody in his family. And that's everybody in his family that he knew, you know, from
and his Memphis guys,
Memphis Mafia,
you know?
all those guys that were, you know, they had different jobs here and there, but it wasn't like they needed to be on a payroll year round. You know, but they were. He bought them houses, bought Jerry Schilling house, bought them cars, bought diamond rings for everybody for the wives. And so when you do that, I mean, you can't stop working. And so Parker knew that Elvis was never going to change. You know, I'm not a Parker defender. I don't like him. I believe that he was a slimeball, carny guy, but he was also he worked 24/7, not just for Elvis, but for himself, but for Elvis. You know, when you do that, live that kind of a life for an artist, you feel like you deserve more money. And, you know, but regardless, I mean, I think it was a truthful statement that he said, hey, you quit working. The money's going to stop. And I also don't think he had faith in Elvis. He'd seen artists come and go. And I think he was very surprised every year when Elvis continued to do something and stay on top and stay relevant. Because I don't think he had the faith. He was a carny. He was you know, and that was fine for Elvis in the early days because Elvis was excited. He went from a poor boy to having more than he could imagine. And he knew that
Yeah.
that he wasn't going to go there with Phillips. He wasn't going to go there with Bob Neal. It was not going to happen. That Colonel Parker had all the contacts in Hollywood. He got a great deal, with RCA in New York, put him on TV shows. So Elvis was a loyal person. And
Yeah.
so he had loyalty to Parker, even when he knew that what he had to keep doing was just he wanted to vomit having to
Yeah.
do these movies because he believed Parker was telling the truth. And Parker in some ways was, but it was only with Parker. If he would have gotten a different manager that was a big manager in the late 60s, early 70s, he would have done great things and done it. And at that point in time, he didn't need Parker anymore, but he wasn't going to throw Parker aside because of his loyalty. Just like his dad, he let his dad do his business, and his dad didn't have a lick of sense when it came to business, except be tight. I'm not going to give nothing to nobody. Yeah, you know.
But I know,
I'm
that book, I was in Memphis when that book came out, Elvis, What Happened?
mm-hmm.
Written by Red West and Sonny
Marty
West.
Lacker, yeah.
Yeah. That, Elvis.
Sorry, Dave Hebler. I'm sorry, I need to correct myself. I don't know whether Marty was involved too, but I know Dave Hebler.
It was Dave Hebler and Red and Sonny West.
Yeah,
and they said that they did it for Elvis to wake him up. I think that killed him. I think after that book came out, I know I was at the gate and nobody wanted to buy it. They didn't want to, give money to them, but everybody wanted to read it. So like we had one copy and we kind of passed it around, but we all read it.
Right.
But I think that the first time Elvis was going to face his fans after that book came out was the day he died.
Right.
And I don't think Elvis would intentionally commit suicide, but I knew that he would have a terrible time. He would be so afraid to face his fans after that book came out. But he didn't realize, Elvis always used to think he's going to be forgotten. I think he'd be appalled today to realize how loved he is and how forgiven his fans were of him. But
and what you said there it's a very controversial thing, and I think a lot of fans have put it out of their mind. It's very confusing why Elvis Presley had codeine in his system. He knew he was allergic to codeine.
Exactly. Yeah.
And he had 10 times. Yeah, and you're a nurse, and he had 10 times the therapeutic amount in general of codeine in his system. So
it was the codeine that killed him.
It was, for sure. Yeah. But here's the great question that'll never get answered. Was it accidentally put into his packages of pills? And there were several. He had 3 or 4 that morning. So 1 or 2 more than normal. Was it accidentally put in there?
I don't think so.
Was it purposely put in there by somebody? Or, what no Elvis fan wants to consider or think, did Elvis take codeine on purpose or on accident? And why it wouldn't be in his room if he's allergic to it. It wouldn't have been for him. It would have been a prescription for somebody in the family, one of the brother-in-law, one of the brother-in-laws or cousins. That's who the codeine would have been written for, because he's allergic, and everybody would have known he was allergic to it, including him.
But I sort of believe that Elvis didn't want to die, but he didn't want to go on tour. I think he wanted to just be unable to go on tour. Mm-hmm. I don't think he wanted to die. And I think that he underestimated what he, but I mean, that's just
that is a possibility.
I think that book killed him.
Yeah. And that's another thing too. Of course, it was released in July, and he had a chance to read it. I'm sure he did.
He begged them not to publish it.
And here's the sad part about all of that. Those guys, Elvis was a proud person that was probably ashamed to admit that he couldn't afford to pay Red and Sonny and Dave Hebler. Elvis had let them go before and brought them back. Let them go before and brought them back because finances were finances. And Red was doing okay. He was a songwriter. He wrote, he was an actor. He wrote Separate Ways. There's nothing left to do.
He wrote If Every Day Could Be Just Like Christmas.
Yes, I believe so too. And, and he wrote some earlier stuff for Elvis, and he was an actor, so he had a way to bring some money in. I don't know about Sonny. Sonny could have been a bodyguard anywhere he wanted to, probably.
Yeah.
Dave Hebler, I don't know, he was kind of a new addition. That Elvis, during that recording with Red West, kind of cussed about him and said he's an SOB. He was trying to play me against everybody. But regardless, it was Vernon's fault that this all happened, unfortunately, because Vernon didn't do what Elvis asked,
Yeah.
which was to give them, a couple months to live on, and he gave them like 2 weeks pay or 1 week's pay, and it was a very low amount. And they felt, and they tried to go to talk to Elvis, and Elvis wouldn't talk to them about it. They felt that they deserved more, and we all know they didn't deserve more.
Yeah.
Yes, maybe if they were, but regardless, what Vernon did set the wheels in motion to maybe put them in a big financial bind. So when somebody tempted them with this book offer and this money, they went ahead and said, you know what, this will probably be good for Elvis. And maybe they didn't say all the stuff the way it came out in the book to this author, Jerry Dunleavy, I think his name was, but that guy's a creep that likes to write sensational negative stuff. And it turned into something that maybe they didn't want it to turn into. Because when I've seen interviews of Red and Sonny crying,
Yeah.
they loved him.
They did. Yeah.
And we know that Elvis has forgiven them, from above. He didn't hold anything against them, but they were Judas to Elvis, and as they betrayed him, they really did. And no matter how they shape it up, they made a big mistake. And I don't think they ever admitted it to anybody. And maybe they did it privately to themselves, that they really, like you said, are a huge responsibility of Elvis dying.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Dave Hebler was just at Memphis. They brought him to talk this year.
Yeah.
And that shouldn't be. I mean, he was instrumental. It wasn't like he was a close confidant of Elvis. Elvis. So it's sad that Elvis is still a business. He's still the cash cow for everybody, right?
Yeah. But what's so sad is Elvis died believing that his fans would not accept him anymore. And it's so sad, that he died believing that he'd be forsaken.
Yeah, I think he was very fearful of it. I mean, because he knew. I think that he knew that his hardcore fans, people that loved him, would still love him.
Yeah.
At least you would hope so. You would hope that. But he knew that the
Yeah.
media was going to be terrible. They were already terrible in '77.
Yeah.
So good.
Getting back to Priscilla,
Okay.
Lisa Marie had read the script to that Priscilla movie. She
Mhm.
begged her mom not to make it,
Yeah.
and she made it anyway because it painted Elvis in such a bad light. But the Elvis movie came out, and then I guess Priscilla felt like she wanted some of the limelight. She wanted to make a movie called Priscilla, which is
Yes.
ridiculous. I mean, she's nothing without Elvis. But I think that I I think she was a terrible mother to Lisa. When they divorced, and she took Lisa. They were joint custody, but she put her in Scientology, in
Yes.
the Scientology
And
school.
Elvis hated Scientology. He said all those
Yeah.
SOBs, one is my money. But to
But
go back
then,
to the movie real quick. So I didn't watch it in the theaters. I mean, I read the same thing that Lisa didn't want Priscilla to do the movie. She wrote
yeah,
to the producer, tried to get Sophia Coppola not to do it. I did watch the movie
on TV.
when it was free. And
I did too.
what a horrible, first off, it's a boring movie. It's a
Yeah,
horrible movie. And you're right, it painted Elvis as a surly, depressive, controlling person. That was the whole
yeah,
movie. There was nothing happy, nothing good. And she signed off on it. So
yeah,
that's why us Elvis fans go, Priscilla doesn't care about Elvis's legacy. They don't care about who he really was. All she wants to do is like the mass media, how it sells fear.
yeah,
That's what's on the all in negativity. She knew that negativity was going to get press, and she was going to make the most money she possibly could. And so that's
Yeah.
why she signed off on it, even though it wasn't the truth.
Yeah. But
So you were talking about Scientology, how
yeah.
Priscilla put Lisa in Scientology after Elvis died.
But Priscilla says Elvis was the love of her life. That is so bullshit because she was with Elvis, what, 7 years? And then she was with that Navarrone's dad for like 30 years.
Right.
I think she was a better a mother to the Navarone than she ever was to Lisa. They never got along. That Navarone and Lisa, they were never close. But all this about Priscilla wanting to be buried at Graceland, I think it'd be a travesty. But then I read that um,
Riley Keough.
Riley was going to allow her to be.
So,
But
so
then
part of the,
I
so
read that,
part of the lawsuit, Nancy, was that if it is available for her to be buried there, that's the terminology. If it's available for her to be buried there, which only 6 people are allowed to be interned there.
that's what I read.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for the
she
city of
can't be
Graceland. But Priscilla is doing all of these free things. She's appearing in Memphis. She's at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. She's doing whatever she can so they would maybe approve her to be put there. And I can't imagine it because there's many. There's Vernon, there's Gladys, there's Elvis, there's Lisa, there's Ben, and there's just a headstone to memorialize Jesse Guerin. So there's
Yeah.
the 6 there already. But I know most Elvis fans don't want it.
Oh,
Because
I
when you
think it'd be a travesty.
I do too. And
Because where would it stop? Then she'd want that Navarone married up there.
Right.
You
Right.
know?
Because as of now, there's only blood relatives there. You got Lisa
Right.
and Ben, and then you got the grandmother, mom, dad, and Elvis.
And Priscilla's not a Presley.
She's not.
She's not a Presley. So,
Yeah.
but
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, and maybe we will do a part 2 because I know there's a lot of stuff to talk about. There's a lot of stories that you have about Gary that I think we've maybe been on for about 2 hours. I think
oh
that's
wow,
kind of
yeah,
which is nice when you're talking and having fun, and
yeah,
and time flies.
yeah.
Um,
Time flies.
but yeah, so is there anything you want to say to the Rare Elvis Photo fans? Really, they're Elvis fans is what they are. They love
Yeah,
Elvis. They love defending Elvis. Most of the people that are not on this page are not Priscilla defenders in the least bit.
yeah.
So is there anything you want to say or any last memory or thought process on Elvis that you want to share before we stop this video for today?
Well, I know that all these years later, when I see him singing a song or pictures of him, he still takes my breath away. And I think that most of Elvis fans are like me, lifelong fans that we understand, we don't, we don't believe he did anything. I mean, he took medication because of his lifestyle. He had to keep going and keep going. And I don't think anybody who's a true Elvis fan would ever criticize him for the lifestyle he led because he was always just a wonderful person,
And thank you for saying that because that's something that the normal person doesn't understand. When you say lifestyle, when you're getting up, when you're going, when you're flying, when you're having to get up and you're doing press interviews and you're having to do rehearsals and you've got all it's hard to go to sleep. It's hard. So you've got to take the downers. And then when your body gets used to them, you have to take more of the downers.
Yeah.
And so there becomes this vicious, and it really affected his body. And it
Oh
wasn't
yeah.
anything Elvis. He wasn't trying to do it. And I think that was very depressing for him. The fact that he went from looking like he did in 64, 58, 69, 71 to not being in control in a sense of how his appearance, the bloatedness in his face from some of the steroid stuff that was going on. And he was not trying to do anything wrong.
Yeah.
And like you said,
I know one woman who I don't know who it was, but she said once that Elvis lived as long as he wanted to. He didn't want to, get old. But, even his last concert when he sang
Unchained Melody.
Unchained Melodies, his voice never faltered.
Yeah.
And he was always beautiful. I mean, when he looked at the camera and smiled, I, he never looked unattractive to me. And I think that's true. I mean, um, he had, his body had um,
It
gotten,
deteriorated. Exactly.
yeah, he just, a lot of it was the steroids, caused the bloating and everything. And
And the blocked intestine and all that stuff. When you have blocked intestines, your body is poisoning itself from the
right,
inside out.
yeah,
And that's a true Elvis fan, but not just a true Elvis fan, but somebody with common sense. You're somebody with common sense, that even if you weren't a true Elvis fan, you could look at the situation with common sense and go, gosh, this is what happened to him. It wasn't anything that he was not trying to kill himself, with drugs. He was not trying to escape life in a sense. He was just trying to get to one day to the next, trying to get to the show.
yeah.
So that must be Jenny calling. Hey, Jenny. Am I right?
What?
Was that Jenny calling?
No, it's I just hung up.
I
It's
gotcha.
something.
Okay, so for this video, one final thought on Gary, and the impact that Elvis had truly on his life. Like, would Gary have lived this long if it wasn't for Elvis?
Yeah.
How do you feel about that? Do you feel like because Elvis was in Gary's life, that Gary, because what is the normal age for somebody with Gary's condition to live?
Well, I think if he had stayed with me, I think he would have lived. He could live to a long life, but the way it was, going into a nursing home, being depressed and everything.
But with Elvis, paying for his care in a sense. I mean, I don't know whether Elvis paid for any of the hospital stuff. I mean, you may not know that. When he went in the hospital and Elvis came over, and Gary was on the floor and Elvis picked him up and put him on the couch, and Gary was like, you don't have to pick me up." The humanity that Elvis showed from that point on, I really feel like Gary could have passed away before you had a chance to take care of him.
Yeah, he was when I first met Gary, I didn't think he was going to survive. He was so sick.
Yeah.
But he just needed somebody to help him, give him a reason for living. But
well, I'm
yeah,
glad you did. I'm glad you were there for him.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't turn my back when I heard him say, "Natney, don't leave me."
Oh.
Yeah, I couldn't do that. But you saw that picture of me on the step with Gary.
Yes.
How good he looked.
He looked
It
great.
wasn't long before that he couldn't turn over in bed.
Yeah, and I'll definitely share that picture. I'm gonna get as many great pictures of you and Gary, as well as Gary and Elvis, and put them in with the video. And I'm even gonna probably reach out to Ann-Margret. I may be able to talk to her prior to doing the whole video, because I really want to make this, a tribute to Gary and a tribute to Elvis and Gary, and it really a tribute to you, Elvis and Gary, too, because you were there all those years, and and you, in a sense, sacrificed a great deal of your life.
Yeah, but it's something that I would never not do.
Yeah, well,
when I look back, it was a big part of my life.
Spoken by somebody who is very much like Elvis, who's a giver. Elvis is a giver. You're a giver. And so I think it's a story that it needs to be told. I know there's other people that have done videos and have talked about it, but it doesn't matter how many times. I would like to repost the video after a while and do it again, because somebody might not see it the first time. They might see it the 11th time I put a video out there. So I'm going to do what I can to continue to keep Gary's memory alive, and Elvis's memory alive of his generosity of spirit and kind soul, and yours as well, and your part in it, which was a great big part. And you also did it partially because of your love of Elvis too. Because So Elvis,
exactly.
Elvis had a hand in that.
Yeah. I was in Memphis because of Elvis. I took the job because of Elvis, but then, you get attached to Gary too.
Yes, of course.
Gary was an incredible person. He was very, very smart. he had a wonderful mind, but he didn't have a body that
Right. He
could
was
express.
trapped in a body. He was trapped like he
He
went.
was trapped in his body, and what's so ironic was his mom had this really strong. She's a very strong, physical woman. She was like 80, and she was really strong, but her mind was gone. She used to do. She would have these manic episodes where Gary. I mean, he just adored his mother, and she adored him. But when she'd have these manic episodes, she'd get really mean.
Hmm.
I know one time she was sitting on the couch, and Gary walked over to her on his knees and like put his head in his lap, and she'd say, "Get away from me, you dog. I went to the hospital to have a beautiful baby, and they brought me this dog." And
Well,
Gary would he'd just cry,
that's so sad.
but
That is so sad because the thing is, I mean, the last thing you want is the people who love you, your parents, to say something that mean. That's just like
uh,
horrific. Even if on her side she was disappointed that she didn't have because she felt like her life had changed.
yeah,
Regardless, that's a selfish spirit. That's not a loving spirit. You know, and I hate that he had to experience that, and in turn, you had to experience that as well because it's the worst of humanity when that
yeah.
happens, something like
I
that.
know that when Mr. Pepper was alive, that he took care of everything
Hmm.
except Gary. And she was a real strong woman. And when he died, she died.
Yeah.
Her mind died. And
And that'll happen.
Gary was right. He said she wanted to die and she wanted to take him with her. But it was just a sad situation. But she'd have these manic episodes that I couldn't really control her. I mean,
No,
my younger brother was there and he'd help me. I know this. We had this ice storm.
ice storm when you had Gary
Now
up in
there's this ice storm where everything. I mean, it was really slippery, and she got out of the house in her little night dress, and she was like barefoot, and I couldn't get her back. My brother helped me, but she grabbed the rose bush and her hand was bleeding, and we get her back in the house. And I know one time I to keep her in the house, I tried to lock her in her room, but she could open any lock.
right.
And so I tied the doorknob to another doorknob, and she could open it about uh, maybe 6 inches. And she spent the whole night banging, banging, banging on that to where the next day she couldn't straighten up because her back was so bent from
So
that.
so
But
did she?
she'd have these manic episodes where she would go for maybe 2 or 3 days without sleeping, just being wild, and then she'd pass out for 3 days, and she'd wake up kind of halfway normal. But I know when Elvis died, she was kind of out of it. But when she heard that he had died, she got kind of normal. She says, "At least he can be at peace for once."
Hmm.
She said
So
that. So, but
so yeah, so
you know,
she was undiagnosed with something, whether it was bipolar and but did she have any physical ailments, like Gary did, or just a normal person who had
she outlived Gary by several years.
hmm,
She um, she was diagnosed as bipolar,
that's what I
and
thought.
I know that she when I was there, they put her in a facility where they actually did the um, shock treatments.
Okay, yeah, shock, yeah.
I don't know if they still do that, but it
Well,
did bring her out of it for a while.
my
But
dad had shock treatments when he came back from the Korean War, and I can't imagine that it really scientifically does anything besides shock your body. I mean, they say maybe it can do something, but that's a sad thing because she had something that she couldn't control. She had out of
yeah,
control bipolar and probably some other stuff that was undiagnosed because
uh,
now we're in the 2020s and this was 1970, 1980.
yeah,
Um, so once again, the listeners and viewers are going to think, oh, Gary's mom was a horrific person. but she probably was as out of control with her emotions and her mind, and as Gary was with his body, because he couldn't control his body. It's something that wasn't his fault.
Yeah. Well, Mrs. Pepper, before Sterling died, she was a very strong, loving woman. That and Gary and her were so close. I mean, she used to, um, take such good care of him, and their whole lives were wrapped up in each other, and that's why Gary would never ever allow himself to be separated from his mom.
Right. Right.
But
Which is noble, even though he endured abuse. He probably understood in his mind, like you said, he had a brilliant mind. He probably understood my mother can't help herself. She's got
yeah,
something wrong with
it
her.
wasn't when she'd have these manic episodes. It wasn't really her.
Yeah.
It was just she. I don't know. But what was so cool about Elvis was because Mr. Pepper died in the guard shack, Elvis felt so responsible for them that he took care of them.
Yeah. But
And,
of course, what I think, wasn't he already giving Gary a salary at that point in time, or no?
yeah, when let's see, I don't know when he actually. Well, I think he was paying Carl Nichols
Okay, good, to
to
take
take
care of,
care of him,
yes. And of
but it,
course, Sterling had a job, so he was also taking care of Gary that way.
yeah, yeah.
So,
But
okay.
I think it was when I came and he would send the check to Gary instead of me.
Right.
And that's when he gave Gary that title, of
Which is,
fan
I
club,
love hearing that. What's the title again that he gave Gary?
fan club coordinator and foreign correspondent.
Warren Course. And I remember, I'll be sharing some of the Tankers newsletters. I'm going to scan them in, Grayson Fan Club, you know, and put them in the video as well.
And if you could find some Elvis Monthly,
Yes, I'll
you
look for
know,
that too. I think I saw some Elvis Monthly on eBay, that I may be buying.
yeah, he wrote for Elvis Monthly with his mom, and then after his mom got and I came, then we started writing another Elvis Monthly called Memories.
Memories. Now I've seen some memories, and in fact,
Yeah,
I may have some on the way. I think I might have inquired about. There was 40 or 50 memories, not
yeah,
episodes, but I guess little magazines or paper booklets that they made.
yeah,
So
yeah,
I will look for those too. And I want to thank you, Nancy, and I want to thank your sister Ginny for putting me with you.
yeah,
We've been talking about doing this for 9 months now, maybe. Uh,
yeah.
so I'm glad now we're both experts on Zoom. You're an expert on Zoom, and
Yeah,
we'll be able to do some more at some point in time, and especially when you remember stuff. Hey Joe, I've got some other stories I want to tell.
yeah.
I'll get together with you. We'll go ahead and capture it, and then we'll share it with the Elvis fans that are out there.
Okay. Yeah, Jenny wants me to let her know how it goes
Well,
today.
good deal. Well, thank you so much, and
Okay.
thanks to all the viewers and listeners of Rare Elvis Photos tuning in with Nancy Pease Whitehead, who was raised Catholic with 4 names, like I was raised Catholic with 5 names. Interesting little tidbit there. And wonderful pictures of Elvis. You want to move the screen up to show people your Elvis pictures on the wall, real quick before we go?
How can I do that?
Just tilt your screen up. There we go. I can see him now.
Can you see
Beautiful.
him?
Yep, beautiful pictures of Elvis up there, and a nice clean white wall. So.
Yeah.
All right. Well, TCB, TLC, Nancy Pease Whitehead. This is Rare Elvis Photos. We're going to go and stop the video. And I'll give you a call after this real quick. All right. Bye.
Okay.